Hi there, and welcome to Abroad with Care, the 10-minute podcast that makes health easy for expats in Asia. My name is Andrea, and every day I help expats make the most of their life abroad. With this podcast, you will finally get the practical answers you need on budgets, hospitals, maternity, and many more topics. Twice a month, leading experts will share advice and tips to help you protect yourself and your family. This podcast is created in partnership with April International, a leading insurance services group supporting expats when it matters. For expats, understanding what vaccinations you and your children need can feel overwhelming. Each country has a unique immunization schedule. So what are the requirements in Singapore and Hong Kong? Which vaccines are mandatory for your kids? And how much does it cost? Today, Mélissandre Noël, general practitioner in Singapore, shares with us everything you need to know regarding vaccinations in both Singapore and Hong Kong. You will not only find out what is required, but also what is recommended. She also talks to us a bit more about the local vaccination strategy against COVID-19. But first, let's listen to Catherine's story. Catherine is from Canada and moved to Singapore 7 years ago. As a mum of 2 boys, she has experienced the vaccination program in Singapore.
I started to think about vaccination after the birth of my first son. I think that in Singapore, you have some mandatory vaccinations at birth. And I believe that if you are actually a foreigner, you're able to refuse giving them right away. So my son was actually born 2 weeks premature and he was quite small. So when he was born, he was weighing only 2.6 kg. So we actually took the decision to delay his vaccinations at birth. I just felt like he was just so tiny. I was able to catch up to the schedule when he was a bit bigger at months, 3, 4, 5, and 6. I think the information is quite publicly available. There is a very standard schedule in Singapore. What's great as well, so I'm very fortunate, my pediatrician is also Canadian, so she was able to compare, what is the Singapore vaccination schedule with the Canadian vaccination schedule and explain, what were the differences. And what I realized actually is that it's very similar to what we have back home. So that made me feel quite comfortable. Another thing is, so the Singapore vaccination schedule is for babies is over 18-month period. And essentially most daycares start at 18 months in Singapore. And essentially when you send your kids to school, they also require that you show the vaccination certificate. So just to put your child in school, you need to make sure that you have completed all of the mandated vaccines by the Singapore government.
Hi, Mele.
Hi, Andrea.
Just like you, Catherine is from Canada. We understand that the vaccination schedule in Singapore is similar to that of your home country. So to begin with, I think it'd be quite important to understand the vaccination culture in Asia. How are vaccinations perceived, particularly in Hong Kong and Singapore? And how is the immunization schedule built?
All right, so that's a great question. First of all, let me start off by saying thank you so much for having me on the podcast, Andrea. And vaccination is a topic that's really close to my heart, so I'm very flattered to be here with you today. So if we get right into it, so the vaccination culture, I'll start with Singapore. So I would say over here, the local population, so the citizens and the PRs, they really believe that kind of the healthcare system is of high quality and that the scientific and the medical leaders and community kind of know what they're doing and have their best interests at heart. It's less of a patient-doctor partnership here, I would say, for the local population. It's more, you go to the expert and you kind of follow their sound medical advice. The vaccination schedule in Singapore is very vaccine heavy in the first 2 years of a child's life. It's to ensure that people are immunized early and to really minimize the spread of infantile diseases, because it's such a small and compact country that could have kind of catastrophic effects. The schedule plans for kids to have received their primary series of vaccinations by age 11, roughly, which is actually quite similar to most immunization schedules in the world. So if you take, most of the European schedules, North American, Australian, New Zealand, I would say most kids around the age of 11 and 12 will have completed their primary series.
Yeah, is it similar in Hong Kong too?
In Hong Kong, I mean, the vaccination culture is very similar to Singapore. Most people tend to trust that the medical system has their best interest at heart and that they've done all the research necessary to be able to build a sound schedule.
Interesting. I mean, we've spoken a little bit about the immunization schedule, but what about mandatory vaccinations? So what are they? And are there any additional vaccinations that you would recommend expats take to keep safe in Asia?
Great question. So in Hong Kong, the good news, I would say, for people who are a little bit more vaccine hesitant and want to discuss more the vaccinations, there are no mandatory vaccines for expats in Hong Kong. That being said, for expats moving to Singapore, there are 2 mandatory vaccines in Singapore. Since 2019, the Ministry of Health has made those 2 immunizations mandatory for anybody who wants to obtain a work pass or employment pass, work visa, any type of long-term visitor passes. And these are diphtheria and measles. If people don't have those vaccinations, if they're kind of above the age when the primary series would be completed, the Ministry of Health will not issue, so the Ministry of Manpower will not issue the work permit until these are completed, or at least that the catch-up is started in their country of origin.
Okay, that's for the mandatory vaccines. But let's discuss the following scenario. Now that the world is reopening again, what vaccines would you recommend to expats if they were able to travel around Asia again soon?
Of course, right now, international travel has kind of been on hold for the past 18 months. But when people can actually travel around Southeast Asia, we recommend 2 travel vaccines, hepatitis A and typhoid fever. They're not present per se in Hong Kong or Singapore, but they would be present in, let's say, if you go to Thailand or Bali or Cambodia or Vietnam. They're 2 illnesses that get transmitted by contaminated food and water, so they're quite easy to catch. So those would be recommended.
As well, I think you've mentioned previously as well children and vaccinations. So vaccinations can be often a complex topic, particularly for parents. Could you provide a bit of an overview on any mandatory vaccinations for babies and children?
For Singapore, as I was saying before, there are no mandatory vaccines. However, for babies who would be born in Hong Kong at birth, they would be offered the tuberculosis vaccine and the hepatitis B vaccine. It would be the same for babies born in Singapore, whether those babies are expat babies or whether they are PRs or citizens. And that's because the risks of contracting tuberculosis and hepatitis B might be higher in Hong Kong and Singapore than it would be in that child's home country. They are not mandatory. That's something that doctors are happy to discuss with concerned or hesitant parents. And even if they're not done at birth or in the 24 hours after birth, that can always be caught up later.
And what vaccines would you recommend for expat babies to be able to travel safely back to their home country, for example?
I would say, we're very fortunate living in Hong Kong and Singapore in the fact that we have pretty much all of the vaccines available, and that the schedules here are often very similar to most of our home countries. So Europe, North America, even South Africa and Australia, New Zealand. I would say the main vaccine that we usually tend to recommend for babies or children traveling back to their home country for, let's say, Christmas or the summer holidays, would be what we call the meningococcal vaccine. The meningococcal vaccine protects against a disease called meningitis. So meningitis is kind of inflammation of the lining of the brain. So it can be quite serious. It is not a concern in Southeast Asia. That being said, most travel clinics will carry that type of vaccine. And we do recommend that babies and kids take that, even if it's just for a short stay of a few weeks or a couple of months in their home countries.
Let's move now into a bit more of a current topic. When it comes to vaccines and the pandemic, what are Hong Kong and Singapore's strategies to deploy the COVID vaccination?
In Singapore, Singapore tends to be a very risk-adverse country. When the cases started going up by Singapore standards, they were very quick to purchase vaccines, to acquire vaccines as fast as possible. I was looking at the numbers today. I think 81% of the general population has been vaccinated, and that's counting that, that's taking into account that 9% of the population are kids under the age of 12 who are not eligible to get vaccinated yet. So they've done a great job of promoting the vaccine. The two recognized vaccines are the mRNA vaccine, so Pfizer and Moderna. Although Sinovac and Sinopharm, who are the two vaccines made in China, are also approved in Singapore, because at the moment China only approves Sinovac and Sinopharm. And if people from Singapore, so citizens or PRs who have family in China, if they want to go and travel to see their family, they have to be immunized with Sinovac or Sinopharm. So they are also available. They've also made it mandatory for some sectors. So people working in healthcare, people who are drivers, food and beverage outlet workers, they either have to be vaccinated or they have to self-pay for twice weekly testing. Also, the vaccinated people are now able to enjoy a bit more freedom. So they can dine in at restaurants, which unvaccinated people still cannot do. They can gather in larger social groups. There's sometimes shorter quarantines when coming back from abroad, or even quarantining at home rather than in hotels or dedicated facilities. So they've kind of made it so people will want to go and get vaccinated.
Okay, so does Hong Kong follow the same strategy then?
In Hong Kong, it's a little bit of a different story. Last I checked was a few days ago, and about 45% of the population was fully vaccinated. It's not going as quickly. The elderly in Hong Kong is a lot more reticent to take the vaccine, and so far the government hasn't been able to increase the uptake. However, for people who want to get vaccinated, it's also free and widely available. In Hong Kong, they've actually made it mandatory for some sectors. So healthcare workers, public servants, teachers, have to get it, or again, pay for testing. But that gets quite onerous at some point. So they're ramping up their efforts over in Hong Kong as well.
Interesting. I mean, you've mentioned paying. I think that's quite an important topic that can go through many people's minds. So how much does it cost?
So let's start with Hong Kong on this one, because it really passes, with flying colors. Childhood immunizations are free for any child or children under the age of 5 if parents bring them to maternal and child health centers. So that's wonderful. So whether you're a citizen or a PR or an expat, child under the age of 5 living in Hong Kong, you can get your kind of basic childhood immunization schedules all for free at those clinics. Other vaccines that are not part of the schedule, they're affordable, they're widely available at private clinics. So even, as we were talking about the meningococcal vaccine, it is available in Hong Kong. You might just have to research a bit kind of which private clinic has it, but it is still quite affordable. In Singapore, however, there's no free vaccines for expat kids. It's more affordable if parents bring their children at hospitals, or the public hospitals, or what we call polyclinics, which are pretty much public walk-in clinics. However, the doctors there or pediatrician might not be as flexible with the immunization schedule. So if parents really wish to follow their home country's schedule in terms of timing of doses, then a private clinic might do them better service, might provide a better service for them. And some vaccines are only available at private clinics. So again, a lot of insurance companies would cover all of that, or at least part of it for the parents.
You've given us a really good overview of vaccinations in Asia, and it's been really great to understand some of the differences between vaccinations, maybe in Hong Kong and Singapore, for expats, those expat parents that are maybe a bit conscious about vaccination schedules for their children and babies. So yeah, thank you very much, Melly.
Thank you, Andrea. It was a pleasure to be on the podcast today.
Thank you for listening to Abroad with Care. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so that you don't miss out on any health-related topics. Your friends may have the same questions as you, and you can help them out by sharing this episode with them. Do you want to know more regarding health insurance? April International is here for you. Find out more information at asia.april-international.com.